Tonight's story begins with a relationship that looked normal from the outside, but behind closed doors, it slowly turned into something far darker. Imagine meeting someone who seems completely in love with you, someone who texts constantly, calls often, and always wants to know where you are. At first, it might feel flattering, even romantic, but sometimes that attention hides something else, something controlling, something unstable. The case you're about to hear is about love that turned into obsession, an obsession that ended in murder. Ryan Poston was young, successful, and well-liked. Friends described him as charming, ambitious, and full of plans for the future. He worked as a lawyer in Kentucky and had the kind of life many people in their 20s were still trying to build. But in 2011, Ryan met someone who would completely change the course of his life. Her name was Shayna Hubers. At first, their relationship seemed normal enough. They met through mutual friends and quickly began spending time together. Shayna was intelligent, outspoken, and confident. She had a strong personality that immediately stood out. But people who knew the couple soon noticed something unusual. The relationship between Ryan and Shayna was extremely volatile. They would break up, then get back together. Arguments were frequent, emotional, and intense. Ryan often told friends that he felt overwhelmed by Shayna's behavior. Sometimes she would send him dozens of messages in a short time. Other times she would accuse him of cheating or lying, even when there was no evidence. Ryan tried to distance himself several times, but each time somehow the relationship continued. Friends later said Ryan seemed conflicted. On one hand, he cared about Shayna. On the other hand, he felt increasingly uncomfortable with her jealousy and unpredictable reactions. As time passed, the tension between them only grew stronger. And then came October 12, 2012. That evening, Ryan was at his condominium in Highland Heights, Kentucky. It was supposed to be an ordinary night. But Shayna Hubers arrived at his apartment. The two had recently been arguing again. Ryan had reportedly told her that the relationship was over. He wanted to move on. According to investigators, this news devastated Shayna. Inside the apartment, the conversation quickly turned into another heated argument. What exactly happened during those moments would later become the center of a courtroom battle. But what investigators know for certain is this: Ryan Poston was shot 6 times. The gun used belonged to Shayna. After the shooting, instead of immediately calling emergency services, Shayna remained inside the apartment. Then, roughly 15 minutes later, she called 911. When police arrived, they found Ryan dead on the kitchen floor, and Shayna Hubers calmly waiting. At first, she told officers she had acted in self-defense. She claimed Ryan had attacked her and she feared for her life. But as investigators began examining the scene, certain details raised serious questions. Ryan had been shot multiple times, including shots fired after he had already fallen. And the pattern of the wounds suggested something that didn't match a typical self-defense situation. Shayna was taken to the police station for questioning. What happened during that interrogation would later shock the public. At first, she appeared emotional. She cried. She talked about the argument. She repeated that she was scared. But as hours passed, her behavior became increasingly strange. She laughed. She joked with detectives. At one point, she even began singing. Detectives continued asking questions, trying to understand what had really happened inside Ryan's apartment. And slowly, pieces of the story began to shift. Shayna admitted that Ryan had told her he wanted to break up. He no longer wanted to continue the relationship. Investigators also learned something important. In the days before the murder, Shayna had been researching violent crimes online, including stories about people killing their partners. Friends of Ryan later told police that he had recently been planning to end the relationship permanently. He had even begun seeing someone else. For prosecutors, this suggested something far more serious than self-defense. It suggested motive. Meanwhile, as the interrogation continued, Shayna's behavior became even more unsettling. She talked casually about the shooting. At one point, she told detectives that Ryan had criticized her appearance and called her spoiled. Another moment that caught investigators' attention came when she said something chilling. She claimed she had shot Ryan because she was afraid. But then she added something else. She said she kept shooting because she thought he might still be alive. That statement would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in court. Investigators also discovered that after the shooting, Shayna had taken a picture of Ryan's body. And while sitting in the interrogation room, she began worrying about something unexpected. Not the crime, not Ryan's family, but how she would look in the media. At one point, she asked detectives if the case would be on television. She even commented about whether she looked crazy. For the detectives in that room, the situation was becoming increasingly disturbing. But the investigation was only beginning. Because as police dug deeper into the relationship between Ryan Poston and Shayna Hubers, they began uncovering a pattern of obsession, jealousy, and escalating tension that had been building for months. Text messages, voicemails, witness statements, all of it painted a picture of a relationship that had become dangerously unstable. And soon, prosecutors would begin building a case that suggested the murder of Ryan Poston was not an act of self-defense at all, but something planned, something deliberate, and something that would lead to one of the most unsettling murder trials in Kentucky's recent history. But to truly understand how this relationship spiraled into violence, investigators needed to look closer at the months leading up to that night. Because the warning signs had been there all along. And some people believed Ryan had been trying to escape long before the final confrontation. In the next part of this story, we'll examine the evidence prosecutors used to argue that Shayna Hubers didn't just react in fear. They believed she arrived at Ryan's apartment already prepared for something deadly. Story 1, RYNPOSTON. Part 2. As investigators continued examining the relationship between Ryan Poston and Shayna Hubers, a troubling pattern slowly began to emerge. What initially appeared to be a toxic relationship now started to look like something far more dangerous. Friends of Ryan told detectives that he had been trying to distance himself from Shayna for quite some time. Their relationship had become emotionally exhausting. Arguments were frequent, and Shayna's reactions could be unpredictable. Sometimes she would send long streams of messages demanding to know where Ryan was. Other times she accused him of seeing other women. Ryan had attempted to break things off multiple times, but each time the separation didn't last long. Shayna always managed to return to his life. According to people close to Ryan, he had recently become more serious about ending the relationship for good. He had even begun dating someone new, hoping to move forward. But when Shayna discovered this, the tension escalated dramatically. Detectives reviewing the couple's messages noticed how intense their conversations had become. Some texts from Shayna sounded desperate, others sounded angry. At times she threatened to expose Ryan or embarrass him. At other moments, she begged him not to leave. This emotional cycle of pleading and hostility created an unstable dynamic that investigators later described as deeply concerning. But the most disturbing discovery came from Shayna's own internet searches. During the investigation, police learned that Shayna had been researching violent crimes before the shooting. Among those searches were stories about people killing their partners and claiming self-defense. For prosecutors, This detail raised a critical question. Was the shooting truly spontaneous? Or had Shayna been thinking about this possibility long before that night? Meanwhile, detectives also examined what happened on October 12th, the day Ryan was killed. Earlier that evening, Shayna had gone to Ryan's condominium carrying a handgun. The weapon belonged to her. Inside the apartment, the two began arguing again. According to Shayna, the argument became heated very quickly. She later told investigators that Ryan insulted her and threatened to break up with her permanently. Shayna claimed that Ryan then became aggressive. She said she feared he might attack her. That was the moment, she claimed, when she fired the gun. But investigators noticed something that didn't match her version of events. Ryan had been shot 6 times. The number of shots alone raised questions. In many self-defense cases, a single shot is fired in panic. But 6 shots suggested something different. Even more troubling was the order of the gunshots. Forensic evidence indicated that some of the shots were fired after Ryan had already collapsed. This meant that the threat, if there had been one, was likely already over. And yet the shooting continued. During her interrogation, Shayna herself had made a statement that prosecutors would later repeat in court. She said she kept shooting because she thought Ryan might still be alive. That comment would become one of the most damaging pieces of evidence against her. As investigators pieced together the timeline, another strange detail surfaced. After the shooting, Shayna did not immediately call emergency services. Instead, she remained in the apartment for several minutes. At some point during that time, she took a photo of Ryan's body. The reason for that photo was never fully explained. Only after roughly 15 minutes did she finally dial 911. When officers arrived, they found Shayna calm and cooperative. But once again, her behavior soon began to shift in unexpected ways. At the police station, her interrogation lasted several hours. Parts of the interview were recorded, and those recordings would later be played during the trial. At first, Shayna cried and appeared shaken. But as time passed, her demeanor changed. She began laughing. She made sarcastic remarks. At one point, she started singing songs inside the interrogation room. Detectives were surprised by the sudden changes in her mood. Even more unsettling were some of the comments she made while sitting alone in the room. Believing she was not being watched, Shayna spoke out loud to herself. She talked about how the case might appear in the media. She wondered whether the story would become famous. And at one moment, she said something that deeply disturbed investigators. She described Ryan as a jerk and complained about how he treated her. The tone of her voice sounded more irritated than remorseful. For the detectives working the case, these recordings raised serious doubts about her claim of self-defense. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors began building a case around several key points. First, the couple's relationship had become increasingly unstable. Second, Shayna had conducted suspicious internet searches about violent crimes. Third, Ryan had been shot multiple times, including after he was already on the ground. And finally, Shayna's own statements during the interrogation suggested she continued shooting even after the immediate threat had passed. Taken together, these details painted a picture that prosecutors believed pointed toward intentional murder. But Shayna Hubers maintained that she had acted out of fear. Her defense team argued that Ryan had been emotionally abusive and that she genuinely believed she was in danger that night. They said the shooting happened in the heat of the moment during a violent confrontation. 2 completely different versions of the same night. One side claiming calculated murder, the other claiming desperate self-defense. Eventually, the case moved toward trial. And when the courtroom proceedings finally began, The recorded interrogation of Shayna Hubers would become one of the most talked about pieces of evidence. Jurors would hear her laughing. They would hear her singing. And they would hear her describe, in her own words, the moments after Ryan Poston had already been shot. But the trial would reveal even more disturbing details about the shooting. Because prosecutors believed that the final gunshot carried a message that was both chilling and deliberate. And when that detail was presented to the jury, it would play a major role in deciding Shayna Hubers' fate. In the final part of this story, we'll follow the courtroom battle that determined whether this killing was truly self-defense, or a calculated act driven by jealousy, anger, and obsession. Story 1, RYNPOSTON. Part 3. By the time the case of Ryan Poston's murder reached the courtroom, it had already drawn national attention. The details were unsettling. A young lawyer with a promising future had been shot 6 times inside his own home. The person responsible was his on-again, off-again girlfriend, Shayna Hubers. But the biggest question facing the jury was simple. Was this murder? Or was it self-defense? The trial began with prosecutors presenting the timeline of events from the night of October 12, 2012. They described how Shayna Hubers arrived at Ryan's condominium carrying a handgun. According to the prosecution, the relationship had already been falling apart for months. Ryan had been trying to move on with his life, and he had recently started seeing another woman. Prosecutors argued that Shayna was devastated by the rejection, and that anger had been building for weeks. They pointed to the internet searches she had made before the shooting, searches involving violent crimes and self-defense claims. For the prosecution, those searches suggested something very important: premeditation. Next, the jury heard about the argument that took place inside the apartment. Shayna claimed Ryan had insulted her and frightened her. She said she believed he was about to attack her. But the physical evidence told a different story. Forensic experts explained that Ryan had been shot 6 times. One of the most critical moments came when investigators described the final shot. Ryan had already collapsed onto the kitchen floor. He was wounded, defenseless, and unable to fight back. Yet the shooting continued. According to the evidence presented in court, the last shot struck Ryan directly in the face. Prosecutors argued that this shot was deliberate. They believed it showed that the threat was already over, but Shayna continued firing anyway. Then came one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the entire case: the interrogation recordings. Jurors watched and listened as the videos from the police station were played in court. They saw Shayna crying at times, but they also saw something else. Moments where she laughed. Moments where she joked with detectives. At one point, she even began singing inside the interrogation room. The courtroom grew quiet as jurors listened to her speaking to herself, while she believed she was alone. In one recording, she commented on how the case might appear in the news. In another moment, she said something that shocked many people in the courtroom. She described Ryan as a jerk. Her tone sounded more annoyed than remorseful. For the prosecution, these recordings revealed what they believed was the truth. They argued that Shayna Hubers had not acted out of fear. They said she acted out of anger and humiliation after Ryan ended their relationship. But the defense presented a very different narrative. Shayna's attorneys argued that the relationship between the two had been emotionally abusive. They claimed Ryan often criticized Shayna and made cruel remarks about her appearance and personality. According to the defense, the argument that night escalated quickly. They said Shayna genuinely believed Ryan might hurt her. Her lawyers argued that she panicked, and in that moment of fear, she fired the gun. The defense also addressed her unusual behavior during the interrogation. They suggested that stress, shock, and emotional instability could explain the laughter and strange comments. They said people react to trauma in unpredictable ways. Throughout the trial, both sides presented witnesses, forensic experts, and hours of testimony. But in the end, the jury had to decide which version of events felt more believable. The prosecution's argument was clear. Ryan Poston was trying to end the relationship. Shayna Hubers refused to accept it. And during a heated confrontation, she chose violence. After hearing all the evidence, the jury reached a verdict. They found Shayna Hubers guilty of murder. The decision brought some sense of justice to Ryan's family and friends, who had spent years waiting for answers. But the story did not completely end there. Due to a technical issue involving one of the jurors, the conviction was later overturned, and a new trial was ordered. For Ryan's family, it meant reliving the entire case once again. The second trial took place several years later. Once again, prosecutors presented the same evidence. Once again, jurors watched the interrogation videos and listened to the forensic testimony. And once again, the jury reached the same conclusion. Shayna Hubers was found guilty of murder. This time, the conviction stood. She was sentenced to decades in prison. For the family of Ryan Poston, the verdict brought a measure of closure, though the loss could never truly be repaired. Ryan was remembered as a bright, hard-working young man with a promising future. Friends described him as kind, intelligent, and someone who always tried to see the best in people. His life ended in a moment of violence that no one close to him could have imagined. Today, the case of Ryan Poston is often discussed as a tragic example of how a toxic relationship can spiral into something deadly. It's also a reminder of how warning signs sometimes appear long before violence occurs. Arguments that grow more intense, jealousy that turns into control, and emotions that begin to overshadow reason. Behind the headlines and courtroom drama, one fact remains the most important. A young man lost his life, and a family lost someone they loved forever. Ryan Poston was not just a victim in a crime story. He was a son, a friend, and a person whose future was taken away far too soon. And remembering that truth is what matters most when telling stories like this. Story 2, SMNTHAKONIG. Part 1. Some crimes happen suddenly, without planning or warning. Others are carefully prepared long before the victim even realizes they are in danger. Tonight's story is about a crime that investigators later described as one of the most calculated and disturbing cases they had ever seen. It begins in Anchorage, Alaska, during a cold winter night in February 2012. Anchorage is a city surrounded by vast wilderness. Long winters, heavy snow, and quiet neighborhoods are part of everyday life. For most residents, it is a place where people work hard, help their neighbors, and expect a certain level of safety. But on February 1st, 2012, something happened that would shake the entire community. 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was working the closing shift at a small coffee stand called Common Grounds. The stand sat on the side of the road, a typical drive-through coffee booth that many locals visited every day. Samantha had worked there for a while, and customers knew her as friendly, polite, and hardworking. She was saving money, thinking about the future, and trying to build her life step by step. That night, Samantha was working alone. Her boyfriend had planned to pick her up after her shift ended. It was a normal routine. She would finish cleaning the stand, lock up, and then head home. But when he arrived around closing time, something felt immediately wrong. The lights inside the coffee stand were still on, but Samantha was gone. At first, he thought she might have stepped away for a moment. Maybe she had gone to the restroom or walked somewhere nearby. But minutes passed. There was still no sign of her. Inside the coffee stand, things looked unusual. Samantha's phone and personal belongings were still there. Her car keys were present. But she had completely disappeared. Her boyfriend quickly called police. At first, officers weren't sure what had happened. Adults sometimes leave work unexpectedly for many reasons. But as investigators examined the scene more carefully, they discovered something that changed the situation entirely. Security cameras from nearby businesses showed a disturbing moment. Late that night, a man wearing dark clothing approached the coffee stand. He opened the service window and spoke to Samantha. Then, moments later, he forced his way inside. Investigators believed he was holding a gun. Samantha was then forced to leave the coffee stand with him. The footage showed them walking together toward a nearby parking lot. After that moment, Samantha Koenig vanished. For her family, the disappearance was terrifying. Samantha was known for staying in close contact with the people she loved. She rarely went anywhere without telling someone where she was going. The idea that she would suddenly disappear without contacting anyone felt impossible. Within hours, the Anchorage Police Department launched a missing person investigation. Search teams began combing nearby areas. Volunteers joined the effort. Posters with Samantha's photo appeared across the city. Her family spoke publicly, begging for any information that might help bring her home. But at that time, investigators had very little to go on. The surveillance video showed the kidnapper, but his face was partially covered. His identity remained unknown. Days passed with no answers. Then, nearly 2 weeks after Samantha disappeared, something unexpected happened. Her boyfriend received a text message from Samantha's phone. The message was short. It said Samantha was safe and would return soon. But investigators immediately suspected something was wrong. The tone of the message didn't sound like Samantha, and the timing felt suspicious. Detectives quickly traced the phone signal and realized the message had been sent from a different location. But the trail quickly went cold. Not long after that message, another disturbing development occurred. Samantha's family received a ransom demand. The message claimed Samantha was still alive. The person responsible demanded money in exchange for her safe return. For Samantha's loved ones, the hope that she might still be alive kept them going. But investigators were beginning to fear something much worse had already happened. As they continued analyzing the evidence, they realized the person behind the crime appeared to be extremely careful. The kidnapper had chosen a moment when Samantha was alone. He moved quickly, and he left very little evidence behind. This level of planning suggested something deeply disturbing. The person responsible might not be a random criminal. He might be someone who had done this before. But detectives still had no name, no clear suspect, and no idea where Samantha had been taken. Weeks passed with no answers. The investigation grew larger as federal agents joined the search. Then, in March of 2012, thousands of miles away from Alaska, a man walked into a bank in Texas. What happened during that bank transaction would finally give investigators their first real lead. And it would soon reveal the identity of one of the most calculated killers American investigators had ever encountered. A man named Israel Keyes. But at that moment, police had no idea just how disturbing the truth behind Samantha Koenig's disappearance was about to become. Because the man responsible had spent years carefully preparing for crimes exactly like this one. And Samantha was not his first victim. Story 2, SMNTHAKONIG. Part 2. By the time investigators received their first real lead in Samantha Koenig's disappearance, more than a month had already passed. For her family, Every day felt like an eternity. The uncertainty was overwhelming. They held on to hope that Samantha might still be alive somewhere, waiting to be rescued. But the truth behind the crime was far darker than anyone had imagined. In March 2012, a man walked into a bank in Texas and used a debit card to withdraw cash from an ATM. At first, nothing about the transaction seemed unusual. But investigators monitoring Samantha Koenig's financial activity noticed something immediately. The card being used belonged to Samantha, and the withdrawal was happening thousands of miles away from Anchorage, Alaska. Authorities quickly traced the ATM footage. The cameras captured a man wearing a hat and casually withdrawing money. He appeared calm, almost relaxed. But this single transaction would become the first break in the case. The man in the video was identified as Israel Keys. At that time, Keys did not look like the kind of person many people would imagine when thinking about a serial killer. He had served in the military. He worked in construction. He owned his own small business. To many people who knew him, he seemed quiet and reserved, but otherwise ordinary. But investigators were about to discover that behind this normal appearance was something deeply disturbing. Police quickly began tracking Keys. Soon after the ATM withdrawal, officers stopped him during a routine traffic stop in Texas. Inside his vehicle, investigators found something alarming. They discovered Samantha Koenig's debit card. They also found a mask, a gun, and several other suspicious items. Keys was immediately taken into custody. At first, he denied any involvement in Samantha's disappearance. But the evidence was already mounting. Investigators knew he had used her card. They knew he had traveled across multiple states, and they knew he had been in Alaska around the time Samantha vanished. Eventually, during questioning, Israel Keys began to talk. What he revealed shocked even the most experienced investigators. Keys admitted that he had abducted Samantha Koenig from the coffee stand that night. He had been watching the location for some time before the crime. He knew Samantha worked there. He knew she often worked alone during closing shifts. According to his confession, he approached the coffee stand with a gun and forced Samantha to leave with him. He then drove her to a secluded location. What happened next was horrifying. Keys admitted that Samantha was killed shortly after the abduction. For Samantha's family, the news was devastating. The messages they had received, the ransom demand, the text messages suggesting she was alive, all of it had been a lie. Investigators later learned that Keys had staged the ransom situation after Samantha was already dead. In a chilling attempt to mislead police, he used her phone and debit card to make it appear as if she might still be alive. But the disturbing revelations did not stop there. As questioning continued, investigators began learning more about Israel Keys himself. And the more they uncovered, the more frightening the picture became. Keys explained that he had spent years planning crimes in advance. Unlike many criminals who act impulsively, Keys believed in careful preparation. He traveled across the country, sometimes bearing what he called kill kits. These kits contained weapons, money, and tools hidden in remote locations. The idea was simple. If he ever returned to those locations later, he would already have everything he needed to commit a crime. Investigators realized this meant something terrifying. Samantha Koenig might not have been his first victim. In fact, Keys hinted that there were others. He admitted to several murders across the United States, but he refused to reveal the full number. He also refused to provide the locations of many victims. At times during the interrogation, Keys appeared calm, even emotionless. He spoke about the crimes in a detached manner, almost as if he were discussing someone else's actions. Detectives tried repeatedly to get more information from him. They hoped he might reveal the identities of other victims, or at least the locations where their remains might be found. But Keyes often refused to cooperate. For investigators, this created a painful situation. They believed there could be multiple families still searching for missing loved ones, and the only person who knew the truth was sitting in an interrogation room, refusing to share it. Meanwhile, authorities in Alaska continued searching for Samantha's remains. Months passed as investigators worked through the information Keyes had provided. Eventually, they located an area where he claimed to have disposed of her body. For Samantha's family, the discovery brought heartbreak, but also a form of closure. The search for answers had finally revealed the truth. But the investigation into Israel Keyes was far from over. Because the more detectives studied his past, the more they began to suspect that Samantha Koenig's murder was only a small part of a much larger and darker story. A story involving hidden weapons caches, years of secret travel across the country, and victims whose names might never be known. In the final part of this story, we'll examine what happened to Israel Keyes after his arrest, and why investigators believe many of his crimes may remain unsolved to this day. Story 2, SMNTHAKONIG. Part 3. After the arrest of Israel Keyes, investigators finally had the man responsible for Samantha Koenig's disappearance. But solving Samantha's case was only the beginning. What detectives were about to uncover would turn the investigation into something much larger and far more disturbing. During the interrogation process, Israel Keyes slowly began revealing details about the crime. He admitted that he had been watching the coffee stand for some time before the abduction. He knew Samantha worked there. He knew she often worked alone at night. And he knew that the location made it easy to approach without attracting much attention. According to Keyes, the abduction had been planned in advance. On the night of February 1st, 2012, he drove to the coffee stand wearing dark clothing and a mask. He approached the window and then forced his way inside while pointing a gun. Samantha had no chance to escape. Keyes forced her to leave the stand and walk with him toward his truck. From there, he drove her away into the darkness. What followed was one of the most heartbreaking discoveries in the investigation. Keyes admitted that Samantha was killed shortly after the kidnapping. But instead of reporting the crime or allowing investigators to find the truth quickly, he attempted to manipulate the situation for weeks afterward. While traveling across different states, Keyes used Samantha's phone and debit card to make it appear as if she might still be alive. He even created a ransom demand, sending messages to her family and investigators in an attempt to buy himself more time. This deception gave Samantha's loved ones false hope during one of the most painful moments of their lives. Investigators later described this part of the crime as especially cruel. But as detectives continued speaking with Keyes, the conversation began to shift away from Samantha's case. They started asking him about other possible crimes. At first, Keyes avoided the questions, but over time, he began hinting at something far more disturbing. He admitted that Samantha Koenig was not his only victim. In fact, he had been committing crimes for years. Keyes explained that he carefully planned his attacks in ways that made them difficult to trace. He often traveled long distances before committing a crime. He avoided targeting people he knew, and he rarely left evidence behind. Perhaps the most chilling detail he revealed involved what he called kill kits. These kits were small containers buried in remote locations across the country. Inside them were weapons, cash, and tools that could be used during a future crime. By preparing these kits years in advance, Keyes ensured that he could return later and commit a murder without needing to carry suspicious items while traveling. Investigators were stunned. This level of planning suggested that Keyes had spent years thinking about how to avoid detection. And it raised a terrifying possibility. There could be many victims who had never been connected to him. Detectives worked tirelessly to gather information from him. They asked about missing persons cases across different states. They showed him photographs. They asked about specific dates and locations. Sometimes Keyes admitted involvement. Other times he refused to answer. He seemed willing to reveal small pieces of information, but never the full picture. Investigators believe he was responsible for multiple murders across the United States, but the exact number may never be known. Despite hours of questioning, Keyes refused to reveal the identities of many victims or the locations of their remains. For families of missing people, this silence created a painful mystery that still exists today. Then, in December 2012, something unexpected happened. Israel Keyes was being held in a jail cell in Anchorage while awaiting trial. But before the case could go to court, he took his own life inside his cell. His death meant that many of the answers investigators were searching for would never be revealed. The locations of hidden kill kits, the identities of other victims, and the full timeline of his crimes. Much of that information may now be lost forever. For Samantha Koenig's family, the arrest of Keyes had at least brought the truth about what happened to their daughter. Samantha was remembered as a kind and energetic young woman who loved music, spending time with friends, and making people smile. She had just begun adulthood, with dreams and plans still ahead of her. Her life was taken in a crime that shocked an entire community. Today, Samantha's story is remembered not only because of the terrifying criminal responsible, but because of the strength shown by her family and the determination of investigators who refused to stop searching for answers. Even though Israel Keyes took many secrets with him, Samantha Koenig's case ensured that his crimes would never remain hidden. And behind every detail of this investigation is an important reminder. These cases are not just stories about criminals. They are stories about real people. People who were loved. People whose lives mattered. And people whose memories deserve to be remembered with respect and dignity. Story 3, Morgan Martin. Part 1. Some disappearances are solved quickly. Evidence is found, suspects are identified, and investigators are able to reconstruct what happened. But other cases are very different. Sometimes a person vanishes without a trace. No witnesses, no body, very little evidence, just a sudden silence that leaves families searching for answers for years. Tonight's story is about one of those cases. It's the story of Morgan Martin. And for a long time, investigators feared they might never truly know what happened to her. Morgan Martin was only 17 years old. She lived in Indiana and was known by friends and family as someone with a bright personality. People described her as energetic, social, and full of emotion. Like many teenagers, her life was still taking shape. But Morgan was also facing something that would change her future in a major way. She was pregnant. For some teenagers, that situation can feel overwhelming. There are difficult decisions to make, and emotions can run high. But according to people close to Morgan, she was trying to prepare for the responsibility ahead of her. She was beginning to imagine what her life might look like as a young mother. In early June of 2012, Morgan was staying at her grandmother's home in the city of Spiceland, Indiana. It was a quiet area where neighbors knew each other, and life usually moved at a slower pace. On June 22nd, Morgan left the house during the evening. At first, there was nothing unusual about it. Teenagers often go out to meet friends or spend time with people they know. Morgan had done that many times before. But this time would be different. Hours passed. Then the night turned into morning, and Morgan never came home. Her family quickly realized something was wrong. Morgan was not the kind of person who would disappear without telling someone where she was going. When they tried calling her phone, there was no answer. Friends hadn't heard from her either. The worry grew quickly. Soon, Morgan was reported missing. Local police began investigating, trying to understand what had happened during those last hours. The first step was to determine where Morgan had gone that night. As investigators spoke with people who knew her, one name began appearing repeatedly: Jacoby Flowers. Flowers was a young man who had known Morgan for some time. According to several people, the two had been spending time together recently. Some witnesses told police that Morgan planned to meet him on the night she disappeared. When detectives questioned Flowers, he admitted that Morgan had come to visit him that evening, but he claimed she left later that night. According to his story, Morgan had walked away from the house on her own. At first, investigators had no reason to immediately challenge his statement. But as the investigation continued, small details began to raise questions. Neighbors near the house reported hearing loud arguing during the night Morgan disappeared. Some said the argument sounded serious. Others mentioned hearing what might have been a struggle. These reports caused detectives to take a closer look at Flowers' version of events. If Morgan had simply left the house and walked away, why had no one seen her afterward? And why had no one heard from her again? Search teams began combing the surrounding areas. Fields, wooded areas, and nearby roads were carefully examined. Volunteers joined the search, hoping to find any clue that might lead investigators to Morgan. But days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of her. As time passed, the investigation became more complicated. Without a body or clear physical evidence, detectives faced a major challenge. They had suspicions. They had witness statements. But proving exactly what happened was another matter. Meanwhile, Morgan's family continued to wait for answers. The uncertainty was painful. They hoped she might somehow still be alive. But as the weeks passed, that hope slowly began to fade. Investigators returned again and again to the same central question: what really happened inside the house that night? Detectives began examining the timeline more carefully. They interviewed neighbors again. They studied phone records. They searched for anything that might contradict Flowers' story. And gradually, small pieces of information started to form a picture that looked very different from the one he had originally described. But even as the evidence began to grow, one problem remained. Morgan Martin's body had never been found. And without it, proving murder in court would become one of the most difficult challenges prosecutors had ever faced. In the next part of this story, investigators begin uncovering the evidence that would slowly turn suspicion into a criminal case, even without the one piece of evidence they wanted most: Morgan Martin herself. Story 3: Morgan Martin. Part 2. As the investigation into Morgan Martin's disappearance continued, detectives faced one of the most difficult situations any criminal case can present. There was no body. In many homicide cases, investigators rely heavily on physical evidence found with the victim. Injuries, DNA, and forensic analysis often reveal exactly what happened. But in Morgan's case, that crucial piece of evidence was missing. Despite extensive searches, no trace of her had been found. Still, detectives refused to give up. They returned to the people who had last seen Morgan alive and began carefully reviewing every detail of that night. Once again, the focus turned to Jacoby Flowers. Flowers had told investigators that Morgan came to visit him on the evening of June 22nd. According to his story, the two spent some time together before Morgan left the house on her own. But when detectives began comparing his statement with other witness accounts, things didn't quite match. Neighbors living nearby described hearing a loud argument coming from the house that night. Some witnesses said the voices sounded angry and intense. Others reported hearing sounds that suggested a struggle. These statements immediately raised new concerns. If Morgan had simply left peacefully, why were neighbors hearing a serious argument shortly before she vanished? Detectives continued questioning Flowers, but his answers remained mostly the same. He insisted Morgan left the house alive. However, investigators began examining other pieces of evidence that told a different story. One of the most important developments came from Morgan's phone records. After arriving at Flowers' house, her phone activity suddenly stopped. No calls, no messages, no movement. It was as if her digital presence had completely vanished in that moment. For detectives, that detail suggested Morgan may never have left the house at all. Meanwhile, investigators also spoke with people who knew Flowers personally. Some of them described tensions between him and Morgan. According to these witnesses, the two had been arguing about the pregnancy. Morgan believed Flowers was the father of the baby, but Flowers had reportedly denied responsibility. This disagreement may have created a serious conflict between them. Detectives began considering a disturbing possibility. If an argument had taken place that night about the pregnancy, the situation could have escalated into violence. But once again, without Morgan's body, proving that theory would be extremely difficult. Then, another witness came forward with information that caught investigators' attention. This person claimed to have seen suspicious activity near the house shortly after the time Morgan disappeared. According to the witness, Flowers appeared to be moving something heavy late at night. The exact details were unclear, but the statement added even more suspicion to the growing investigation. Police also searched the property and surrounding areas multiple times. They used trained dogs, examined nearby land, and followed several possible leads. But despite their efforts, Morgan Martin was never located. For her family, the situation was heartbreaking. Not knowing where Morgan was, or what had happened to her, created a constant feeling of uncertainty. They continued hoping that someone, somewhere, would come forward with new information. Meanwhile, prosecutors began reviewing the evidence detectives had gathered. Although the case was complicated, several key points stood out. Morgan was last seen entering Jacoby Flowers' house. Neighbors reported hearing an intense argument inside. Morgan's phone activity ended while she was there, and witnesses suggested suspicious activity occurred shortly after the argument. Taken together, prosecutors believed the evidence pointed strongly in one direction. Even without a body, they believed Morgan Martin had been murdered. Building a case without physical remains is extremely rare, but it is not impossible. Courts sometimes rely on circumstantial evidence when enough pieces fit together to tell a clear story. After reviewing the investigation, prosecutors made a decision. They would charge Jacoby Flowers with murder. For Morgan's family, the arrest brought a mixture of emotions. There was relief that someone was finally being held accountable. But there was also sadness, because Morgan herself had still not been found. The case would now move to trial. And in that courtroom, prosecutors would face the difficult task of proving a murder had occurred. Even though the most important witness, Morgan Martin, could not be there to tell her story. In the final part of this case, we'll follow the courtroom battle where jurors had to decide whether the evidence was strong enough to convict, even without the one piece of proof investigators had searched for from the very beginning. Story 3: Morgan Martin. Part 3. By the time the case of Morgan Martin reached the courtroom, several years had passed since the night she disappeared. For her family, the wait had been incredibly painful. Every day without answers felt like a heavy weight. Morgan had vanished without a trace, and despite years of searching, her body had never been found. Yet prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to prove what had happened. The trial of Jacoby Flowers would become a rare type of case, often referred to as a no-body homicide. In these cases, investigators must prove that a murder occurred even though the victim's remains have never been discovered. It is one of the most challenging situations prosecutors can face. The trial began with the prosecution carefully laying out the timeline of Morgan's final hours. They explained that on June 22, 2012, Morgan Martin left her grandmother's house to visit Jacoby Flowers. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing her heading toward his home. Flowers himself admitted she had come over that night. But according to prosecutors, Morgan never left that house alive. Jurors listened as investigators described the neighbor reports from that evening. Several people had heard loud arguing coming from inside the home. The argument sounded serious, and the voices appeared angry. These statements suggested that something violent may have happened inside the house. Next, prosecutors presented Morgan's phone records. The data showed that her phone activity stopped completely while she was at Flowers' home. From that moment forward, there were no messages, no calls, and no signals showing movement. For someone who normally stayed in contact with friends and family, that sudden silence was extremely unusual. Then the prosecution addressed the issue of motive. Witnesses testified that Morgan and Flowers had been arguing about her pregnancy. Morgan believed he was the father of the child, but Flowers reportedly denied this and did not want the responsibility. Prosecutors argued that this disagreement may have triggered the confrontation that led to Morgan's death. The court also heard testimony from witnesses who described suspicious activity after Morgan disappeared. One witness claimed to have seen Flowers moving something heavy late at night near the property. While the details were not completely clear, prosecutors argued that this could have been an attempt to hide evidence. As the case continued, investigators explained the extensive searches that had been conducted. Police had searched nearby land, fields, and wooded areas. They had used search dogs and followed multiple tips. But despite years of effort, Morgan Martin had never been found. The defense presented a different argument. Flowers' attorneys maintained that Morgan had left the house alive. They argued that there was no direct evidence proving a murder had occurred. Without a body, they said, it was impossible to know what had truly happened. They suggested that Morgan might have left voluntarily or encountered danger somewhere else. The defense emphasized the lack of physical evidence tying Flowers directly to a homicide. For the jury, the decision would not be simple. They had to weigh circumstantial evidence against the absence of a body. They had to determine whether the timeline, witness testimony, and phone records told a convincing enough story. After hearing all the testimony and reviewing the evidence, the jury began deliberating. The question before them was clear. Did the evidence prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Morgan Martin had been murdered? And if so, was Jacoby Flowers responsible? After hours of discussion, the jury reached their decision. Jacoby Flowers was found guilty of murder. For Morgan's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice. Even though Morgan herself had never been found, the court recognized that a crime had taken place. The man responsible had been held accountable. Still, one painful mystery remains. Morgan Martin's body has never been located. Her family continues to hope that someday her remains will be found, so she can finally be laid to rest. Morgan was only 17 years old when she disappeared. She was preparing to become a mother, facing a future that was full of both challenges and possibilities. Her life ended before that future could begin. Today, her story serves as a reminder of how difficult and complex some investigations can be. Even without physical evidence, determined investigators and prosecutors sometimes succeed in uncovering the truth. But behind the legal process and courtroom decisions is something much more important. Morgan Martin was not just the center of a criminal case. She was a daughter, a granddaughter, and a young woman whose life mattered deeply to the people who loved her. And remembering her life is just as important as solving the crime that took it away. Story 4: Shannon Stafford. Part 1. Some stories begin with danger appearing suddenly, but others begin quietly, long before anyone realizes that something terrible is coming. Tonight's story is about a young woman who spent much of her life searching for stability, trust, and a place where she truly belonged. Her name was Shannon Stafford, and the tragedy that ended her life would come from the very people she believed she could trust. Shannon Stafford did not have an easy childhood. She spent much of her early life moving through the foster care system. For many children, foster care can be a difficult experience. Homes change, families change, and stability is often hard to find. But despite those challenges, Shannon tried to build a life for herself. Friends described her as someone who wanted love and acceptance more than anything. She enjoyed spending time with people she cared about and hoped one day to have a stable home and family of her own. Like many young adults who grow up in foster care, Shannon sometimes struggled with finding her place in the world. But she continued trying to move forward. In 2010, Shannon was living in Texas. She had started forming new friendships and was trying to build connections with people she trusted. Among those people were two individuals who would eventually play a major role in her life. Their names were Stephen Nichols and his wife, Julie Nichols. At first, the couple appeared to be supportive friends. They spent time with Shannon, talked with her often, and seemed willing to help when she needed support. For someone who had grown up without consistent family connections, that kind of friendship meant a lot. But over time, the relationship between Shannon and the Nichols couple became complicated. Some people later described the situation as emotionally intense. Shannon seemed deeply attached to the couple, and the couple themselves maintained a strong influence over her life. As months passed, the dynamic between them began raising concerns among people who knew Shannon. Friends noticed that Shannon's behavior sometimes changed, depending on her interactions with the couple. At times she seemed happy and hopeful. Other times she appeared stressed or emotionally overwhelmed. But no one imagined that the situation would eventually lead to violence. In early 2010, Shannon continued spending time with Stephen and Julie Nichols. They lived together for a period of time, and the relationship between the three of them became increasingly complicated. The exact nature of their relationship would later become a major focus during the investigation. But at the time, it simply appeared to be a group of people sharing a close personal bond. Then one day, Shannon Stafford suddenly disappeared. At first, there was confusion. People who knew her tried contacting her, but she didn't respond. Days passed without any word from her. For someone who usually stayed connected with friends, this silence felt unusual. Concern slowly began to grow. Eventually, Shannon was reported missing. Investigators started looking into her last known movements, trying to understand where she had gone and who she had last been with. Very quickly, detectives learned something important. The last people known to have seen Shannon alive were Stephen and Julie Nichols. When police first questioned the couple, their responses raised immediate suspicion. Their stories about Shannon's disappearance were inconsistent. Details changed from one conversation to the next, and investigators began noticing gaps in their explanations. Meanwhile, as detectives dug deeper into the relationship between Shannon and the Nichols couple, disturbing information began to surface. Witnesses described emotional conflicts between the three of them. Some said the relationship had become tense and unstable. Others hinted that jealousy and control may have played a role. But without clear evidence, investigators were still trying to piece together what had actually happened. Then, during the investigation, detectives uncovered information that would completely change the direction of the case. Evidence suggested that Shannon Stafford had not simply disappeared. Something violent had happened, and the people responsible might be the same individuals who once claimed to be her friends. In the next part of this story, investigators begin uncovering the disturbing truth about what happened to Shannon Stafford, and how the people she trusted the most became the focus of a shocking murder investigation. Story 4: Shannon Stafford. Part 2. As investigators continued searching for Shannon Stafford, the focus of the investigation quickly centered on the last people known to have seen her alive: Stephen Nichols and his wife, Julie Nichols. At first, the couple insisted they had nothing to do with Shannon's disappearance. They told police that Shannon had simply left their home one day and never returned. But as detectives began examining the situation more closely, their story started to fall apart. The timeline they provided didn't match what other witnesses had reported. Some details changed every time they were asked new questions, and the inconsistencies raised serious suspicion. Investigators then began speaking with people who knew Shannon personally. Friends described her relationship with the Nichols couple as complicated and emotionally intense. Shannon had grown very close to them, possibly because she had spent much of her life without a stable family. For someone who had grown up in foster care, the attention and connection from the couple may have felt like the kind of support she had always wanted. But according to several witnesses, the relationship eventually became unstable. There were arguments, there were emotional confrontations, and some people believed jealousy had begun to play a role in the situation. As detectives continued digging into the case, they also began examining the Nichols property more carefully. Search teams looked for any physical evidence that might explain what happened to Shannon. Then, investigators discovered something that changed everything. Evidence suggested that Shannon had not simply walked away from the home. Instead, detectives began to believe that a violent confrontation had taken place. Forensic analysis revealed signs that something serious may have happened inside the residence. Although the details were disturbing, investigators were now convinced that Shannon Stafford had likely been killed. But proving exactly what happened would still require more evidence. Detectives increased the pressure on Stephen and Julie Nichols, continuing to question them about the events surrounding Shannon's disappearance. Eventually, the investigation reached a turning point. One of the suspects began to reveal information. During questioning, details started to emerge about what had actually happened inside the house. According to investigators, the relationship between Shannon and the Nichols couple had become dangerously volatile. Arguments had grown more intense over time. Emotions had escalated, and at some point, a confrontation turned violent. Authorities later learned that Shannon had been attacked inside the home. The violence that occurred was severe. Afterward, instead of reporting the crime, the people responsible attempted to hide what had happened. Investigators believe that efforts were made to conceal evidence and mislead authorities about Shannon's disappearance. For detectives working the case, the situation was heartbreaking. Shannon had trusted these people. She had considered them close to her. Yet they were now the primary suspects in the investigation into her death. Eventually, both Stephen Nichols and Julie Nichols were arrested and charged in connection with the crime. The case shocked many people who followed the investigation. It was difficult to understand how a relationship that once appeared supportive had turned into something so violent. But the legal process was only beginning. The case would soon move into the courtroom, where prosecutors would present the evidence explaining exactly what happened to Shannon Stafford. And during that trial, jurors would hear disturbing details about the events that took place inside the Nichols home. Details that revealed just how tragic Shannon's final moments had been. In the final part of this story, we'll follow the courtroom proceedings and the verdict that would determine the fate of the people responsible for Shannon Stafford's death. Story 4: Shannon Stafford. Part 3. By the time the case of Shannon Stafford reached the courtroom, investigators had spent months gathering evidence and reconstructing the events that led to her death. For Shannon's friends and the few family members who followed the case, the trial was painful to watch. Shannon had already lived a difficult life. Growing up in foster care meant she had spent years searching for stability and belonging. The people she trusted the most had now become the focus of a murder trial. Prosecutors began the case by explaining the relationship between Shannon Stafford and the Nichols couple. Stephen Nichols and his wife, Julie Nichols, had once appeared to be supportive friends in Shannon's life. They welcomed her into their home and formed a close connection with her. But according to prosecutors, that relationship gradually became unstable. Arguments began to happen more frequently. Tensions grew stronger. And eventually, those tensions escalated into violence. The prosecution explained that Shannon had been staying with the couple when a serious confrontation occurred inside their home. Witnesses had previously described emotional conflicts between Shannon and the Nichols couple. Those conflicts eventually reached a breaking point. According to investigators, Shannon was violently attacked inside the house. The injuries she suffered were severe. Instead of calling for help or contacting authorities, the Nichols couple attempted to hide what had happened. Prosecutors told the jury that after Shannon was killed, efforts were made to conceal the crime and mislead investigators about her disappearance. The investigation eventually uncovered evidence that contradicted the couple's original statements. Detectives also presented forensic findings that suggested a violent incident had taken place inside the residence. As the trial continued, jurors listened carefully to witness testimony. Some witnesses described the complicated emotional relationship between Shannon and the couple. Others spoke about the behavior of Stephen and Julie Nichols after Shannon disappeared. Their actions, prosecutors argued, were inconsistent with the behavior of innocent people. Instead of immediately reporting Shannon missing, their explanations about her disappearance changed multiple times. These shifting stories raised even more suspicion. The defense attempted to challenge the prosecution's version of events. Attorneys argued that the situation inside the house had been chaotic and confusing. They questioned some of the witness testimony and suggested that the evidence might not clearly prove what had happened. But the prosecution continued presenting details that connected the Nichols couple directly to Shannon's death. The case became a powerful example of how relationships can sometimes hide darker realities beneath the surface. What had once appeared to be friendship and support had eventually turned into manipulation, conflict, and violence. After hearing days of testimony and reviewing the evidence, the jury began deliberations. The decision they faced was serious. They needed to determine whether Stephen Nichols and Julie Nichols were responsible for the murder of Shannon Stafford. After careful consideration, the jury reached its verdict. Both Stephen Nichols and Julie Nichols were found guilty for their roles in Shannon Stafford's death. The convictions brought some measure of justice to the case. But for the people who cared about Shannon, the verdict could never erase the loss. Shannon Stafford had spent much of her life searching for connection and stability. She trusted people she believed would care for her. Instead, that trust was ultimately betrayed. Her story is a painful reminder of how vulnerable some people can be when they are searching for belonging and support. Today, Shannon Stafford is remembered not only as a victim of a tragic crime, but as a young woman who deserved the chance to build a better life. She was someone who wanted friendship, safety, and acceptance. And like every victim in cases like this, her life mattered far beyond the headlines of the investigation. Remembering that truth is what gives meaning to telling stories like Shannon's. Because behind every case is a real person whose life should never be forgotten. Story 5, Sierra Eleamar. Part 1. Some disappearances happen in places where danger seems impossible. Quiet neighborhoods, familiar streets, ordinary mornings where nothing feels out of place. But sometimes, even in the safest places, something unthinkable can happen in just a few moments. Tonight's story begins in the small community of Morgan Hill, California. A peaceful town known for its quiet neighborhoods, schools, and close-knit community. For families living there, it felt like the kind of place where children could grow up safely. But on the morning of March 16, 2012, that sense of safety was suddenly shaken. 15-year-old Sierra Lamar was getting ready for school. Like many teenagers, her mornings followed a simple routine. She would leave home, walk to the bus stop, and ride to school with other students. That morning started the same way. Sierra left her house carrying her school bag and wearing comfortable clothes for the day ahead. Her mother was still asleep when Sierra left. It wasn't unusual. Sierra had taken the bus to school many times before. The walk to the bus stop was short, just a normal part of her daily routine. But that morning, Sierra never made it onto the bus. When the school day began, teachers noticed she was absent. At first, it didn't immediately cause alarm. Students sometimes miss school for many different reasons. But as the hours passed, Sierra's family realized something was wrong. She had never arrived at school. Her friends hadn't seen her, and no one could remember seeing her get on the bus that morning. Concern quickly turned into fear. Her family contacted authorities, and soon the Morgan Hill Police Department began investigating Sierra Lamar's disappearance. Detectives started by retracing Sierra's usual route to the bus stop. It was a quiet residential area. Nothing about the street suggested violence or danger. But as investigators searched the area more carefully, they began finding small pieces of evidence that raised serious concern. Near the roadside, police discovered Sierra's bag. It contained some of her belongings, including clothing she had been carrying with her. The discovery immediately suggested that something unusual had happened. Sierra would never have abandoned her belongings voluntarily. Search teams began examining the entire area. Volunteers joined police officers, combing nearby fields, neighborhoods, and open land looking for any clue that might lead them to Sierra. The community responded quickly. Hundreds of people came together to help search for the missing teenager. Flyers with Sierra's photograph appeared throughout Morgan Hill and nearby cities. Her family spoke to the media, asking anyone with information to come forward. But the most important question remained unanswered. What had happened between Sierra leaving her home and reaching the bus stop? Investigators believed that whatever happened must have occurred within a very short period of time. Somewhere along that short walk, Sierra had vanished. Detectives began examining surveillance cameras, from nearby homes and businesses. They interviewed neighbors and anyone who might have been outside that morning. Every small detail mattered. Days passed, but no clear suspect emerged. Then investigators discovered something important. Near the location where Sierra's belongings were found, forensic teams identified DNA evidence connected to an unknown individual. This discovery would become a major breakthrough. The DNA profile did not belong to Sierra or any member of her family. It belonged to someone else, someone who may have been involved in her disappearance. Police entered the DNA into national databases, hoping to find a match. Meanwhile, the search for Sierra continued across large areas of California. Law enforcement agencies joined the investigation. The case quickly gained national attention. But even with the growing investigation, Sierra herself was still missing. Her family continued waiting for answers. Every day without news made the situation more painful. Yet investigators were quietly working behind the scenes, following the DNA evidence that had been discovered near the scene. And eventually, that evidence would lead them to a suspect, a man whose vehicle had been seen in the area the morning Sierra disappeared, a man named Antolin Garcia Torres. But at that moment, police were only beginning to uncover the evidence that would connect him to the disappearance of Sierra Lamar. In the next part of this story, investigators begin piecing together the forensic clues that would transform Sierra's disappearance into a full murder investigation. Story 5, Sierra Elia Mayor. Part 2. As the search for Sierra Lamar continued, investigators began focusing closely on the evidence discovered near the roadside where her belongings were found. At first, the area seemed quiet and ordinary, but forensic teams carefully examined every detail. Even the smallest clue could help explain what had happened during the few minutes between Sierra leaving her home and reaching the bus stop. One of the most important discoveries was the DNA evidence found at the scene. Investigators collected biological samples from items near Sierra's bag. These samples were analyzed and compared with records stored in national databases. Eventually, the results produced a match. The DNA belonged to a man named Antolin Garcia Torres. This discovery immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Garcia Torres was a local resident who lived not far from the area where Sierra disappeared. Detectives began researching his background and movements during the morning of March 16th. They soon learned something important. Garcia Torres owned a red Volkswagen Jetta, and according to witnesses, a vehicle matching that description had been seen driving slowly near Sierra's route that morning. Investigators obtained surveillance footage from nearby locations. Although the footage did not clearly show Sierra being taken, it did capture a red Volkswagen Jetta moving through the area around the time she disappeared. This detail strengthened the connection between Garcia Torres and the crime scene. Detectives continued gathering evidence. Forensic analysis revealed that Sierra's DNA was also found inside Garcia Torres' vehicle. This discovery was critical. It suggested that Sierra had likely been inside the car at some point during the morning she vanished. Based on the growing evidence, police arrested Antolin Garcia Torres in May 2012. The arrest brought some hope to Sierra's family and the community. But one heartbreaking fact remained. Sierra Lamar had still not been found. Despite extensive searches across large areas of California, investigators were unable to locate her remains. Authorities continued questioning Garcia Torres, hoping he might reveal where Sierra was. But he refused to cooperate. He denied involvement and declined to provide any information that might lead investigators to her. As the investigation continued, detectives carefully built a timeline of the events that morning. They believed Sierra had been abducted while walking to her school bus stop. The encounter likely happened quickly. The evidence suggested she had been forced into Garcia Torres' vehicle before anyone nearby could notice what was happening. The forensic findings and vehicle evidence pointed strongly toward a kidnapping. But without Sierra's body, proving murder would be a major challenge in court. Still, prosecutors believed the evidence was powerful enough to move forward with charges. They argued that the DNA evidence, the vehicle sightings, and the timeline all connected Garcia Torres directly to Sierra's disappearance. Meanwhile, Sierra's family continued searching for answers. Her mother spoke publicly about her daughter, describing Sierra as a kind, creative teenager who loved writing and music. Friends remembered her as thoughtful and friendly, someone who always tried to help others. For the community of Morgan Hill, Sierra's disappearance left a deep emotional impact. Volunteers continued organizing searches. People wore green ribbons in support of Sierra and her family. Years passed, but the hope of finding Sierra never completely disappeared. Eventually, the case moved to trial. In the courtroom, prosecutors would present the forensic evidence linking Antolin Garcia Torres to the crime. Jurors would hear about the DNA, the vehicle sightings, and the timeline that investigators had carefully reconstructed. But they would also face the difficult reality that Sierra herself had never been found. In the final part of this story, the courtroom battle begins as jurors must decide whether the evidence proves what investigators believe happened on that quiet morning in Morgan Hill. Story 5, Sierra Lamar. Part 2. As the search for Sierra Lamar continued, investigators began focusing closely on the evidence discovered near the roadside where her belongings were found. At first, the area seemed quiet and ordinary, but forensic teams carefully examined every detail. Even the smallest clue could help explain what had happened during the few minutes between Sierra leaving her home and reaching the bus stop. One of the most important discoveries was the DNA evidence found at the scene. Investigators collected biological samples from items near Sierra's bag. These samples were analyzed and compared with records stored in national databases. Eventually, the results produced a match. The DNA belonged to a man named Antolin Garcia Torres. This discovery immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Garcia Torres was a local resident who lived not far from the area where Sierra disappeared. Detectives began researching his background and movements during the morning of March 16th. They soon learned something important. Garcia Torres owned a red Volkswagen Jetta, and according to witnesses, a vehicle matching that description had been seen driving slowly near Sierra's route that morning. Investigators obtained surveillance footage from nearby locations. Although the footage did not clearly show Sierra being taken, it did capture a red Volkswagen Jetta moving through the area around the time she disappeared. This detail strengthened the connection between Garcia Torres and the crime scene. Detectives continued gathering evidence. Forensic analysis revealed that Sierra's DNA was also found inside Garcia Torres' vehicle. This discovery was critical. It suggested that Sierra had likely been inside the car at some point during the morning she vanished. Based on the growing evidence, police arrested Antolin Garcia Torres in May 2012. The arrest brought some hope to Sierra's family and the community. But one heartbreaking fact remained. Sierra Lamar had still not been found. Despite extensive searches across large areas of California, investigators were unable to locate her remains. Authorities continued questioning Garcia Torres, hoping he might reveal where Sierra was. But he refused to cooperate. He denied involvement and declined to provide any information that might lead investigators to her. As the investigation continued, Detectives carefully built a timeline of the events that morning. They believed Sierra had been abducted while walking to her school bus stop. The encounter likely happened quickly. The evidence suggested she had been forced into Garcia Torres' vehicle before anyone nearby could notice what was happening. The forensic findings and vehicle evidence pointed strongly toward a kidnapping. But without Sierra's body, proving murder would be a major challenge in court. Still, prosecutors believed the evidence was powerful enough to move forward with charges. They argued that the DNA evidence, the vehicle sightings, and the timeline all connected Garcia Torres directly to Sierra's disappearance. Meanwhile, Sierra's family continued searching for answers. Her mother spoke publicly about her daughter, describing Sierra as a kind, creative teenager who loved writing and music. Friends remembered her as thoughtful and friendly, someone who always tried to help others. For the community of Morgan Hill, Sierra's disappearance left a deep emotional impact. Volunteers continued organizing searches. People wore green ribbons in support of Sierra and her family. Years passed, but the hope of finding Sierra never completely disappeared. Eventually, the case moved to trial. In the courtroom, prosecutors would present the forensic evidence linking Antolin Garcia Torres to the crime. Jurors would hear about the DNA, the vehicle sightings, and the timeline that investigators had carefully reconstructed. But they would also face the difficult reality that Sierra herself had never been found. In the final part of this story, the courtroom battle begins as jurors must decide whether the evidence proves what investigators believe happened on that quiet morning in Morgan Hill.